Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today and coming to see our webinar, Building Sales Capabilities in Our New Digital World. Presenting to you today will be myself, David Wentworth. I am the Principal Learning Analyst here at Brandon Hall Group. I am joined by Dr. Michael Leimbach, who is the Vice President of Global Research and Development for Wilson Learning Worldwide, as well as Charlie Chung, who is Vice President of Solutions at NovoEd. I would also like to extend a thank you to one of our Brandon Hall Group preferred solution providers, NovoEd, for sponsoring today's webinar. So a bit about NovoEd. NovoEd's collaborative learning platform empowers organizations to design and deliver experiential learning that accelerates business performance on a global scale. Since the company's founding at Stanford Social Algorithm Laboratory in 2012, global corporations, executive education providers, and training firms have all relied on NovoEd to develop high-value capabilities through purposeful practice and application, coaching and mentorship, and group collaboration. NovoEd's proven approach to learning connects diverse groups of learners, mentors, and leaders in a high-impact online environment, unlocking your organization's collective knowledge and driving measurable outcomes. And then for those of you who might not be familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that our Excellence Awards Spring program is now open for submissions. I think there's maybe a couple of weeks left. We have added about a dozen categories across programs, so be sure to visit the website and check for the latest. Onto our surveys. Your participation in the Brandon Hall Group surveys is probably the most crucial component of our research. If you see any surveys on this schedule that you might want to participate in, it's always greatly appreciated. Participants always receive a complimentary piece of research once the results are analyzed, and you can visit the Brandon Hall Group website and click on Open Surveys to see what is currently available, so thank you for that. We also have a few logistics about the current webinar that we're on. It is being recorded, and a link to the recording and slides will be provided to everyone within about 24 hours of today's webinar in a follow-up email. You can also download the slides in the handout section of your control panel, which is on that side. So you look there, and there's also a question box over there, and that's the way you're going to communicate with us today. If you have any questions, feel free to use that box. We'll be keeping an eye on those throughout, so if there are some relevant questions, we'll try to answer them in real time. We'll also try to make sure we have some time at the end to catch anything that we may have missed. So please use that. And also, if you just have anything you'd like to share, maybe a comment or a statement, you can use that question box as well. So with that, let's jump into the agenda and remind everybody what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to let you know who my co-presenters are in a little bit more detail. We're going to dig into our research that shows what the business imperative is behind this new way of looking at sales training and enablement. And we're going to dig into how exactly to develop sales capabilities in this new digital age, and what are the design principles that go into reinventing this digital training. And of course, like as I mentioned, we will have a little bit of time for Q&A as well. So with that, I did want to talk about my co-presenters a little bit. So let's just see. So Charlie Chung, he's the VP of Solutions at NovoEd. He spent 8 years in sales and marketing management consulting, where he helped numerous companies of any size and structure, and he helped their sales force and refine their value propositions. At NovoEd for the past 5 years, Charlie has helped design and develop a substantial number of online training programs at large Fortune 500 companies, universities, and nonprofit organizations. And then we have also Dr. Michael Leimbach. He's the Vice President of Global Research and Development for Wilson Learning Worldwide, and he has more than 35 years experience. Dr. Leimbach has managed major research studies in sales, leadership, and organizational effectiveness. He developed Wilson Learning's impact evaluation capability and ROI models, and is a published author and global speaker. So we're very happy to have him with us today. So with that, what I wanted to do is go ahead and start off with that business imperative that I mentioned and dig a little bit into our research to sort of set up the premise here. When we look at organizations in our annual HCM Outlook study, we ask, what are your top business priorities every year? And the number one priority, and actually by a pretty decent margin, is improving the customer experience. So it's top of mind for business leaders is how do we do better with the customer experience? And of course, one of the front lines in that customer experience would be the sales professionals, right? They're the ones that are initiating that customer experience for most organizations. You can also see down there, number 3, improving sales effectiveness. So actually becoming better at delivering results through sales. So out of that top 5, 2 are very directly related to sales enablement, sales training. So it's very important that organizations figure out how best to do this. If we look at the next piece that digs in a little bit more around, okay, what about in this new environment that we're in, right? I think we're all pretty well aware of the situation that the globe is in with this pandemic, and it has had a pretty strong impact on all organizations in many different ways. So we ask companies, okay, as you look through the pandemic and what is sort of on the other side, what are the main focuses that you have as you go through this transition period? And you can see here, top of mind, generating sales and revenue. So once again, very, very directly related to that sales role. How do we do a better job, and how do we manage in this new environment, whatever might have changed for your particular organization? How do we generate those sales and revenue in this environment? And it may require a wholesale retraining of the sales team. So it's a critical element of this transition. And then more specifically, looking into sales training itself, we asked organizations, when you look at sales training, what is it that you're trying to do? And you can see here, not too surprising what companies are after. They just want their sellers to be able to perform better and more consistently. And I think that's a really huge issue, is that once we get people to perform well, how do we maintain that level of consistency? And obviously, sales training is a big piece of that. And then you see other things like, creating those customer experiences that build loyalty. Again, that customer experience begins with sales. I think a lot of organizations tend to think of the customer experience as after that process, but it really starts there. And so just showing you what are the things that companies are after, why this stuff is so critical, and why it has such a direct impact on the organization. It isn't just about the sales numbers and the bottom line. It's a bigger picture than that, and it's much more critical. So yeah, with that, I think what I want to do now is turn to you, Charlie, I believe, to take us into digging into what's going on with the new digital sales training environment.
Yeah, this is Michael. I'll take over from here. Thank you, David. That was great information about the priority of sales and customer experience for organizations. And one of the big challenges we face is when we talk to sales executives, there is this overriding fear that everything has changed, or this underlying belief that nothing has changed. So you talk to sales executives and they say, oh, everything's changed, our process doesn't work, our methodology doesn't work. Or there's this belief, well, no, sales is sales. They don't need any new skills, they don't need any capabilities, and they don't need to learn any differently. It's just, nothing has really changed. But the reality is that both are true. Everything has changed and nothing has changed. When we say nothing has changed, what we mean is that the challenge remains the same. We need to develop a sales force that serves as a source of competitive advantage for their organization. But the how of selling has changed dramatically. Both the how of selling and the how of developing new capabilities for salespeople. While the COVID pandemic has accelerated this change, the reality is that this change has been an ongoing process for many organizations. And so we're here to really talk about how do you understand this changing landscape within the context that the challenge remains the same and that nothing has changed around that, to create an effective organization and an effective sales organization. But to do that, I want to start out getting a sense of where you are. We've got a great audience here, so let's talk a little bit about what's going in your organization. I'd like you to answer this quick poll. What aspects of Salesforce is your organization struggling with most? And you can select all that apply. If you go ahead and, I think, is the poll up? We can go ahead and just select.
It is indeed.
Great. So, identify, are your win rates declining? Are more customers holding off on making decisions? Is the sales cycle, the length of your sales cycle, growing? Is it taking longer to bring salespeople up to proficiency? Go ahead and vote, select those things that you think are your organization's biggest struggle, and in a few more seconds, we'll bring up the results of the poll so people can see what's happening.
Yeah, we've got a pretty good response here. I'll give it another second or two to get us a good representation of the folks on the line, and then we'll share those results. I think that's
Right.
looking good. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to go ahead and share these results, and it should pop right up there, and hopefully everyone can see that. And then there you go. Michael, what do you think?
Great. So, what's clear is that almost everything is going on. At least a quarter of saying that win rates are declining, big shift in terms of customers holding off on decision, but also sales cycle and the time to proficiency for salespeople are just growing organizations. And in fact, what you're seeing really reflects what a lot of the research shows. We've looked at various sources of information about kind of what are organizations struggling with, not just this past year, but over a couple decades. And a lot of this research came from Dr. Martin at University of Southern California, where we're seeing all of these things having a big impact on organization performance. So if we can go to the next slide, what's happening to organizations from a sales performance standpoint. The first is we have seen win rates fall over time, not just this past year, although this past year has been pretty dramatic. But on average, win rates have fallen to below 50%. Now, every industry is different. Some are a lot higher than that, some are a lot lower, but on average, it's gone from about win rates of 60, 70% to below 50% for organizations, and is still falling and dramatically falling this year for many organizations. I think one of the biggest issues is no decision rates. We've seen no decision rates count for about a quarter of all sales opportunities. Is that customers are just saying not making a decision right now, holding off, various reasons for that, but that's been a dramatic increase. We've also seen sales cycles grow. They've grown by about 33%, or about a third. So if your sales cycle was a 3-month cycle, it's now a 4-month cycle. If it was a 8-week cycle, it's now a 10-week cycle. So it has really grown in length. And also, probably most relevant to today is that proficiency, time to proficiency for salespeople has grown steadily over the past several years. In fact, the research shows that the majority of salespeople don't reach proficiency till by about 12 months on the job, meaning that, and by proficiency, we mean that their revenue, the profit margin they're generating accounts for all of their costs plus some. So they're actually delivering to the bottom line for the organization. And a big problem with that growing time to proficiency is that the average tenure of salespeople has been declining. So we're seeing on average, tenure is about 18 months. If you think about it, time to proficiency is 12 months. Average tenure is 18 months. That means you're spending a year to get them up to proficiency, to get maybe 6 months of performance out of them, and then you've got to replace them. So organizations are really struggling with, how do we create an environment where we can bring people up to speed faster and create an environment that is keeps them within the organization and lengthens that time of tenure, so that you can really have greater performance that delivers bottom line value to the organization. And that is a real struggle that a lot of our clients have been going through, particularly this past year, because there's kind of a dilemma when you look at what they have been experiencing. The sales force really likes and feels that the best learning environment for them is face-to-face. A large part because they love to share experiences with their peers. The use of role plays and simulations, a lot of the sales skills they learn are not hard from a knowledge standpoint, but are hard from an execution standpoint. And so the role plays and simulations really give them a chance to experiment with their skills. The spontaneous discussions and networking, you see a lot of salespeople working together on projects or getting advice from each other. And in face-to-face learning, you can do a lot more real-time application to the sales opportunity. So they can talk about, how do I apply the skills to this particular situation where I'm struggling getting this customer to make a buying decision. Also, there's a lot of data that says face-to-face learning has worked for organizations. We've seen, in fact, we've done one study where we showed an increase of 54% of bottom line sales performance, increase in revenue generation by salespeople just as a result of going through a learning program. But you can't do face-to-face right now. And so you have to start looking at alternatives. But a lot of the sales leaders in organizations grew up in an environment where they saw traditional e-learning as not being effective. People talked about completion rates, that early research on e-learning showed that 85% of learners who start an e-learning program ever finish. Also, less than 80% of those actually transferred their skills to the job. So a small percentage are completing the program, a smaller percentage are actually using the skills on the job. And they're not really seeing, didn't see that traditional e-learning as effective. My boss is famous for saying that, original e-learning was not interactive learning, it was interruptive learning. So, but there's the alternative, virtual learning, but they also see that as a poor substitute to classroom. It's not as engaging. You're stuck by that 80-10 rule where 10% of the people make 90% of the comments. And there's really few opportunities, as in face-to-face, for individual coaching around opportunities in sales organizations. So what has this led organizations to do? It's led them into what we call the cycle of reaction. That when the pandemic first hit, we had a lot of organizations hesitating. Let's put it on hold, let's wait, it'll be over in a few months, we'll be able to go back to doing what we're doing. Well, that's clearly not worked, and so they've evolved into what we call from hesitation into replication. Well, let's do the next best thing. So a lot of them turn to virtual learning. In fact, we did a study recently, found that 80% of organizations during this past year have switched to virtual learning. But now we're reaching a stage where we realize that there is something beyond and go into reinvention, that there is a better way to do learning that can reduce time to proficiency, increase the commitment salespeople have to their organization, and increase retention, and really do all those things that allows for organizations to extract greater value from the salespeople that they have in their organization. And that's really what we're here to talk about today, is how do we create an environment that leverages what we know makes for successful sales performance. Because one of the things we've done when we were kind of exploring options and working with NovoEd to find out the right way to do it, we found that there are certain things that made sales learning successful. One was the immediate impact on performance. Salespeople need to leave a learning event where they know they can apply that immediately. Second, salespeople want to be recognized for their past experience. They all come into this process knowing a little bit about sales, knowing a lot about buying, and they have a lot to share about that. And so they need to be recognized for their past experience as part of the learning process. And old-fashioned e-learning never did that. They need engaging experience. You probably all know salespeople. They have pretty short attention spans. They need to be engaged. And they love to share what they know with others and to learn from each other, as well as learn from an expert, a facilitator, a coach, a manager that has more experience from them. And we started looking around saying, how do you recreate that environment in a more digital format? How do you make sure that the experience salespeople have in that environment shares many of the same characteristics they've had all along? And so what we did is really looked at this as a process. And in fact, one of the things we did some research around manager coaching, because one of the things we found is that manager coaching, particularly in the sales environment, has a huge impact on performance outcomes. And so we've actually, prior to working with NovoEd on the learning platform, we had actually implemented a process that we called application challenge assignments. In this case, salespeople were given a real-life application challenge, use a specific skill with a specific client. They were to create a document or a video and then send that to their manager. Their manager was to give them feedback on how well they did that. And they do a series of assignments with different skills to really help build their ability to apply those with the environment. And we had the opportunity, because we started this as an email process where we email these things back and forth. We have data before we used an effective learning platform to really integrate management into the learning process. And we were able to measure how many assignments were completed as well as how much managers provided feedback. And prior to the learning platform, we found that only about 40–45% of salespeople completed their assignments, and only less than 5% of managers provided feedback on those assignments. Clearly, it was too hard, too complex for them to engage effectively in the learning. So once we started working with NovoEd and putting this within a platform that made it easy for both salespeople to do assignments and managers to provide feedback, we found tremendous increase in the percentage of assignments completed, the percentage of times managers provided feedback to their salespeople. And this really showed us the path forward in terms of how you can create an environment that's not only as effective as the face-to-face learning we had been doing, and potentially more effective than the face-to-face learning. And it's really based upon a series of design principles that we with NovoEd have put into place around creating learning that's effective for a sales force.
All right, so thank you, Michael. What I'd like to do in this next section is to talk about 4 powerful training design principles for the digital learning age. First, I'd like to launch a quick poll and ask the following question. Do you consider the following training design principles to be very important? And you can select as many as you'd like to that apply. So we'll give people a few seconds to answer this. The options are: keep attention through flash and sizzle, ensure the experience is highly expert-driven, drive towards simple takeaways, and create tools for manager follow-up. So please weigh in, and we'll take a look at the results in a few seconds. Looks like we're getting some good responses here.
Yep, absolutely. And if you have anything that you wanted to add to that, like if it's just something you feel is important, you can put that into the question box and we'll be able to see that, and maybe we'll share some of those as well. But yeah, just driving it, which, if any, or all, or none of these fit the bill as far as being an important training principle to you or your organization. I think we've got a good representation, Charlie, so I'm going to go ahead and share the results here, and we should all be seeing that.
Great, thank you. Wow, we've got a couple of very clear winners here in the latter two: drive towards simple takeaways and create tools for manager follow-up. All right, excellent. So when we talk about these 4 things, you know, I said that I would give you 4 powerful digital design principles, and I'm going to walk through each of them. But these 4 that we just polled are actually not those principles. I'm going to make an argument to you today that these in some ways can be actually quite counterproductive. And we actually want to focus in some sense on the opposite of some of these principles. So let me explain and lay out what the 4 principles are that I would propose, and then we'll talk a little bit about each one. So first is allowing your audience to focus. Second is to actually not try to monopolize the answers. Third, to expose nuance and judgment. And 4, to design managers into the learning experience. All right, so these are the 4. Let's start with the first one. So rather than keeping attention through flash and sizzle, what I'd like to talk about is the importance of allowing your audience to focus. You know, the biggest challenge with digital training programs is a lack of engagement. People don't want to do them. They can't stay in them very long. We've got a very busy sales audience. And, you know, if you can't engage people in your digital training, then how are they going to learn? So it's perhaps the _1 challenge that we face. And a number of years ago, actually, people jumped onto this sort of trend or idea of gamification. They said to themselves, hey, we see people playing Angry Birds for hours at a time. If we could only make learning like a video game, we can then keep people engaged in it, right? And so that was the thinking. And gamification can be very powerful, but people took that to an extreme and really went overboard. And it was a little bit of a fad that has since deflated and has come down. The fact is, nobody is really mistaking a training program for a video game. So it's a little bit of a false premise there. The other thing is we should have known better, because we know from human learning principles, from adult learning principles, there's a concept of cognitive load. And the more stimuli that you expose a brain to, the less capacity that we actually have to learn. So you have to be very careful about putting things in there that could potentially be distracting just because you think it's going to capture attention. So yes, you can stimulate some attention through the flash and sizzle, but what you can't stimulate is true engagement through that. So one of the big lessons that people are starting to realize from thinking about this is that it's really, really important to have a user interface in your training program that's clear, clean, simple, consumer grade. I mean, think about it. Everybody's used to using Facebook or Twitter or other apps on their phone, and those apps are designed very simply, very clearly. Now, if you're going to put together a training program that they're going to consume digitally, you've probably got to be even more simple than those apps, because they're spending a lot of time in those apps. So it's worth them, spending time learning how to use all the features and functionality. We've got to be really simple in the user experience here. Let me give you an example of this. And as a way to illustrate, I'll show Wilson Learning's counselor salesperson training program. And this is something that's implemented on the NovoEd platform. But this is an example. Whatever methodology you're using, whatever tools you're using, you can strive to incorporate some of these same principles. Here is a home base for the particular sales learner. And I just want to point out a few things. One is white space, right? We don't have a lot of extraneous things popping up, flashing different sections, a lot of confusing signals. It's very clean and simple. Second is a clear sense of progress. You see those dials there. There are some requirements for going through the program. The learner is able to see where they are. There's a little call out there where they might drill in and see exactly what they have to do next. And then third is a path. So we're seeing a little bit of that down below, where there's an introduction and there's a sequence. You want to let your learners know what the big picture is, where they are and what's coming next. You don't want to surprise people by just having them click from one screen to the next and not have any idea of what's going to show up on their screen next. So that's the lesson for us today, is clear, simple user interface. And I think all of us, now that we're used to great apps on our phone, are starting to understand the importance of this. All right, let's move to our second design principle. Now, this does sound good, right? Ensure experience is highly expert driven, but it can be taken to an extreme. And what I would like to sort of promulgate here is this concept: don't monopolize the answers. Now, if, say, you're teaching a new sales methodology, it might be tempting to say, hey, this is a 4-part methodology. Here's what people need to learn. Here are the questions they need to ask, and try to just stamp that methodology in people's brains. Well, that might actually work if you're dealing with people new in their careers who are maybe fresh out of school and don't have any work experience. But that's generally not the type of audience that we're dealing with. And what's a very important adult learning principle, which Michael alluded to earlier, is that people need to incorporate their prior experience when they learn something. You can't actually just transplant new information. It has to be embedded, and it has to be more or less grafted into people's existing experience so they can latch onto it, they can understand it, they can incorporate it in a way that's accessible to them. So that's why it is important to let people sort of grapple or grasp those concepts that you're trying to teach in their own way. Now, you know, the face-to-face training, which Michael pointed out in the research, is, you know, effective and highly liked by training audiences. Really good facilitators actually know this intuitively. Right? They take this approach that we're illustrating here. They're not trying to be just the sage on the stage. They're trying to be the guide on the side. A really good facilitator in say a 60-minute session will go in, and they might have 3 or 4 questions in their mind that they're going to go and talk about and really facilitate a discussion around, asking those questions at just the right time, giving people time to pause and think and reflect, right? They're not walking in there saying, oh my gosh, 60 minutes, I better have 20 multiple choice questions written down so that you know, I can be quizzing people all the time. So we are used to that in a really well facilitated face-to-face training program. The challenge when we talk about digital programs, when we talk about creating online programs, is that you don't see the audience when you're creating that program ahead of time. So it's human nature to just try to think about, oh, I want them to think about something for 60 minutes. Well, let me have 25 minutes of content. Let me have, you know, 6 or 8 multiple choice questions. I'll quiz them like this. I'll have them do this and have that. And to really over-engineer that experience. And the lesson that I take away from this is that as digital instructional designers or digital sales trainers, we also, just like the in-person facilitators, we need to learn to let go. It's okay to just have, you know, 5 minutes of content and try to get 25 minutes of dialogue and conversation. That would actually be a better experience than having 25 minutes of content and a small 5-minute application. So let me give you an example of this so that it's a little bit more concrete. And again, you can implement these types of things in multiple ways. This is one example, and I'll show you actually 2 different examples here. Here's an example going through the same counselor or salesperson program. You can see there's a prompt here, and this prompt is a question. Now, this question might be something that a facilitator might ask, right? That same type of question, something that taps into prior experience. You can see that there's a discussion prompt there. People are contributing to that. People can respond and reply to that and so forth. Now, please don't mistake this for a discussion board. This is not a discussion board where there's 50 topics and 500 posts. This is happening in the flow of the learning experience. So you can show a piece of content, and then instead of relying on quizzes, which we have come to over-rely on in the e-learning world, why not try to incorporate some dialogue, some conversation, some discussion? Yes, it does feel like a risk because you don't know what people are going to say and you don't have a facilitator there to keep pulling things out of people. But in my perspective, I think it's better to take a risk with the right approach and have a chance at deeper learning for those who engage with it than to guarantee a suboptimal approach by just having canned content and canned quizzes. So you can see on the right some examples of the types of questions you might want to solicit. Now, you can go one step further as well, and I'll show you an example here of structured feedback. So if you can get people to react to each other, that is really the golden goose of learning and how people can learn from their peers. So here's an example where people are being asked to give feedback. They're being prompted on the type of feedback to give, the amount of feedback to give, and then down below, they're being exposed to each other's work. So these are maybe reflections or challenge applications that others are putting out there. And through modern platforms, you can start to expose these things to the learners so that they can start to encounter each other and encounter other experiences.
You know, Charlie, this is a great example that we found of unintended consequences of these kinds of activities. What this is, salespeople are supposed to post a question that they ask of customers as a way to build empathy, and then their peers are evaluating them. We found that the opportunity to share those actually created additional benefit. Like we in the first virtual session we do after this exercise, we found a number of salesperson actually gone in and copied and pasted into a document all of the questions that they reviewed of their peers as a way to build a library of these kinds of questions that help them build trust and empathy with their customer. So it kind of feeds into what we call this inside out learning approach, the idea that they have innate knowledge about their customers and their situation that they love to share with others and that have value to others, as opposed to outside in, which is just keep throwing knowledge at them. Giving them opportunities to share this builds knowledge within that organization as well as ties people together. So it's a great application of question and response activities.
Yeah, that's right. And this goes back to what you were talking about as well, Michael, in that people don't necessarily understand what the options are, right? They think, hey, either I'm going to have a rich live experience and it has to, I might need to do that virtually in these long webinars, or if it's online, it has to be solo, simple, sort of all by yourself learning. And with modern approaches, modern tools, you don't have to face that dilemma anymore. You can do things that are asynchronous. People don't have to be all together at the same time, but they can still be exposed to each other's work. These are just some examples of that. All right, let's move on to design principle number 3. And this one I'm going to have a challenge in trying to debunk this as a myth, because this was selected by most of the respondents as one of the most important principles. But what I would like to just talk about is exposing nuance and judgment. So I do believe in the concept of KISS, keep it simple, stupid. But the problem with KISS is that people interpret it too simply. So here's the distinction that I would draw, and we'll see if you guys agree with me. Feel free to post in the questions if you've got additional thoughts on this. But what I would say is that there's a difference between learning new concepts and learning how and when and where to apply those concepts. So what I would propose is that the concepts themselves do need to be simple. So in that, I would agree. But just understanding the concepts doesn't get you very far in being able to apply them. And in learning how to apply them, where to apply them, that's where the nuance and judgment and the subtlety comes in. So that's the area where that we want to try to expose. Okay. If you think about expertise, how do we develop more expert salespeople? Salespeople who can develop deeper relationships, who can uncover needs better, who can be team players and work on more complex, client accounts. How do we develop that expertise that generally, just accumulates with experience? Well, it's through these things related to nuance and judgment. You might, for example, teach someone about some basic negotiation skills. In these situations, you should start off with this type of framework and follow these steps. But what happens when the conditions are a little bit different? What happens when they uncover new information and different contexts, right? So being able to apply those negotiation skills in a really expert way does require them to be exposed to nuance and judgment. The question is there a way to do this without just relying on years of experience, right? Without just relying on osmosis and having 5 years in the role, 10 years in the role? Well, from a learning standpoint, we do have an answer to that. And that is being able to practice and then being exposed to other people's practice. So let me give you an example of that to sort of illustrate this. The example I'll give you is a little bit of a mini framework for teaching here, referred to as crawl, walk, run, in how you sequence and move people along a journey. This is for a particular concept. So here, this is the crawl portion of the concept. So when explaining the concept, you do want to convey it simply and clearly. So in that, I do agree with the KISS principle. Here you can see there's an audio component to teaching a particular concept. Now, next you might have, this is the walk portion, you might have a knowledge check. I'm not totally against quizzes. I'm for using them appropriately, But quizzes like this can be a good way to sort of activate people, to ensure recall. You can make them a little bit, more like a simulation, that sort of thing. But this is just at the walking point. We haven't run yet. So what could that look like? Here's an example of run. There's various ways you can do this, but here is an application challenge, something that Michael had referred to earlier. And you can see that the learner is being asked to record a video of themselves or upload a file. So if we were to do that, there would be a little countdown timer, and maybe someone's being challenged to record their articulation of a value proposition. Or maybe you present an objection and they're supposed to articulate an objection handler. Or maybe they're reflecting on a post-mortem or something like that, right? So lots of different uses. And the media can really, vary. Maybe they are filling out a template, maybe they're turning in some slides. It really can be tailored to what you want them to do, what you want them to practice. Now, turning that in by itself, though, is not the end of the story. That's not how you get at the nuance and judgment. That's how they can express it. But how do they pick up and learn more? Well, that's when they get exposed to other people's work. So similar to what I showed you earlier, here down below on the lower right, you can see that after I do my video practice, now I need to go in and look at least 3 other people's video practice and comment on them or evaluate them or weigh in on them. So that's, if you think about it, that's the same type of dynamic that you have in a face-to-face workshop. You have the facilitator maybe asking for a volunteer to articulate something, and then everybody else in the room hears that and can chime in with additional thoughts, and it spurs new ideas. It gives them, more understanding of some of the shades of gray, different perspectives, and so on. It's that encounter with other perspectives that helps you to build that nuance and that judgment.
And this is a great example of a good match between the skill they're learning and the application of the assignment. For example, this was a very simple skill called purpose, process, payoff agenda. And the concepts are not hard. So the crawl and walk are easy. But when they get to running, we found when in talking to salespeople that almost none of them sat down, read the instructions, hit record button, recorded, posted, and moved on. In fact, some of them said they recorded it 15, 20 times before they were satisfied. And so there was a practice built into this activity that was not necessarily intended, but served a really great purpose. It helped them understand the nuance and judgment that goes into delivering a good PPP statement, because purpose, process, payoff, easy concepts, using them in front of a client, very hard. And so it gave them this opportunity to really learn about the nuance of the skill for real time, and then being able to see each other's examples, show them alternative ways of doing things, expanding upon that knowledge base.
Charlie, before we get off into too far away from the previous bit about the conversations and how that works, a question did come in from the group, and Ivan was saying, in his experience, they've had it where the learners would enter comments during the e-learning, but then it wasn't an ongoing dialogue. It sort of ended there. So what do you think about how can learners be prompted to return to an e-learning course to engage in a discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that does bring up another factor to take into account if you want to really maximize this, and that is that with new digital tools, you can actually spread out the learning over time. So you might take what was a one-day in-person workshop face-to-face, and you might spread that out over 4 weeks. You will get the highest engagement if you kind of say, look, we're going to start, at the beginning of July and end at the beginning of August, so that people feel like they're part of a cohort. You've got to have them thinking about the same concepts at the same time. It doesn't quite work as well when everybody's at a different place and they're just going through self-paced learning. So if you can arrange it so they move through it as a cohort, you space it out over time, you are giving them that space within those 4 weeks, 5 weeks, whatever the case may be, in order to have that dialogue back and forth. And there's various ways you can pull people back into the platform, releasing content on a schedule, and so forth. And then what we find that most organizations want to do is they want to then have the ongoing dialogue occur in their corporate communication and collaboration tools. So the point is not to bring that learner back into the learning environment for years and keep talking about things. The point is to say, hey, where should this ongoing dialogue exist? Should it be in Microsoft Teams? Should it be in Slack? Should it be in Salesforce, someplace else? And then migrate to those tools. But having a separate sort of standalone training environment as a place where they can ask the dumb questions and get their bearings and get them in the habit of building up those skills makes a lot of sense. So that's what I would say are some of the interesting possibilities with today's digital tools.
Yeah.
Well, also, I think the platform gives you this opportunity to fully integrate the learning activities into a seamless process. So, for example, in many of these cases with these discussion activities, examples they use, we will do periodic virtual application sessions with a facilitator, and the facilitator or coach will go into the system and pull out the comments, and then they will have a set of comments that can spur a further discussion or application activity within the virtual live session together. So you're fully integrating. They know that what happens in the digital space is going to be happening in the live virtual space with them. And so it doesn't make them the old-fashioned blended of just multiple separate channels of learning. It integrates the learning into a single experience for them, both virtual, live, as well as digital.
Yeah, and just one last thing before we move on is another thing that can be very helpful is to build into the process a required step, or however you want to incentivize it to be done. But after someone has experienced a particular bit of learning and they've gone through it, they should then come back to that content and be asked to come back and say, okay, give us an example of how this applied in the real world between then and now. And most folks are very excited to actually do that, to say, hey, this actually came up in this scenario and this is what happened. And it's a great way to get people back who have already been through something, have already experienced something, and come back to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the underappreciated strong motivators of human behavior is just the ability to share and share what one has learned with others. So you're absolutely right. When people have a chance to share best practices, especially a lot of people in sales are working in smaller silos or maybe in a lone wolf capacity. But to bring them together and to say, look, you've got a lot of experience that you've built up, through what you've done. Come and share that with others and share ideas and best practices. You generally find a lot of enthusiasm for doing that. All right, let me go to design principle number 4. And if you've got additional questions, please go ahead and add them. We will have Q&A shortly. So creating tools for manager follow-up, it's not a bad idea, but a better one is to design managers into the learning. And we've got a lot more opportunities to do that now that we have digital learning tools. So whenever you try to do things post a learning event, I think anybody who's ever been involved with training or learning knows that it's extremely difficult. It's extremely challenging, right? People are, no matter how good that learning intervention is, that learning experience is, people are then jumping back into the busy flow of their everyday working lives. Now, there are things that people can do. There are techniques. You can incorporate some reinforcement learning to try to remind people. You can try to incorporate some just-in-time tips, maybe have some configure something in your CRM to pop up on certain occasions that also reinforce that learning. You can change how the manager interacts with people, give them a checklist, or even change the competency model so that the performance evaluations correspond to the methodologies that they've learned in the training. So there are things you can do, and all of those things are important. But if your goal is to actually change behavior, there's no better way to get behavioral change to happen after the training than to make that behavior change happen during the training. So, in the old face-to-face paradigm, obviously it's not possible to have every salesperson's manager attend and sit in on all these face-to-face trainings, right? Totally not feasible. Guess what? You can do that with these digital training tools. Now, the large caveat there is that you've got to make it easy and simple for those managers. You can't just invite them into this huge online environment where they're expected to look around or constantly check for things or monitor discussion threads or things like that. You've got to make it simple and easy and intuitive. So there are ways that you can do that. Let me show you an example of one of those ways. Here we have an example of a manager dashboard, and it's something very clean and simple. This manager has 9 people that are direct reports, and they see progress. So if they see that someone's falling behind, maybe they could nudge them and encourage them to continue. But more than just visibility and just communication, there can be the concept of actually evaluation. Let me show you a simple evaluation, and let me show you a more structured evaluation. The simple evaluation might be something as follows, where someone has turned something in, whether they're typing in something or submitting a video, like in this case, and then the manager can simply click on this approve button down below because it meets a minimum threshold of criteria, or they could put in comments and send it back so that the learner has to go in and revise and resubmit. So this is the simplest mechanism of all. You really allow for a lot of qualitative judgment here, and it's just a simple pass-fail, if you will. So this is the simple approach and probably the easiest thing that you could ask a manager to do. You can get more rigorous with this. So here's an example of another evaluation that's much more structured. So on the left, maybe there's some slides that someone has put together. And on the right is an evaluation form. You can see that it's structured with specific criteria, and there's some ratings. There can be some qualitative feedback as well. Now, these criteria, you want to match up to other things that you're trying to teach them. So if you're teaching a 4-part framework for conducting discovery with the new prospect, for example, then you would make this evaluation form into 4 parts. You would have those ratings correspond to those different elements, and you would then reinforce both with the participant as well as with the manager, them thinking through that same framework together. If you wanted to make this framework match your organization's competency model for that role, you could do that as well. And then you've got a nice tie into performance management. And these are the types of things that can persevere after the training in one-on-ones between the sales folks and their managers as they talk about implementing what they've learned in these methodologies. All right, does this actually work? Well, Wilson Learning has actually gathered some data on this in terms of manager involvement. So Michael, I'll invite you to speak to this particular result.
Sure, and great example to this last point around manager involvement. This has been an interest of ours for a long period of time. And we've had an opportunity to do a series of studies, 9 different organizations involved, about 300 managers involved in it. And each organization was different. So each organization had a different approach to manager involvement in the work they did. But the one consistency is they all provided us with measures of sales performance and changes in performance before and after the learning process. In some of the organizations, they provided no manager coaching. Manager wasn't involved at all. Manager didn't know how to coach. Manager wasn't encouraged to coach. And what we found in those cases, they got about a 10% increase in performance as a result of the learning program. Not bad, but not great either. Other organizations train their managers how to coach the skills in parallel with them. And here we found a significant increase, more than doubled or about doubled the performance impact. Again, these are bottom line, they are top line performance, revenue generated, margin attainment, quota achievement. But when we implemented it into the learning solution, like we've done with NovoEd, what we found was a tremendous increase in the impact of the manager's involvement on the organization's sales performance. about a 44% increase in sales performance over no manager coaching when the manager was integrated, as we've talked about, into the learning process itself, not just as a follow-up to the learning, but integrated directly into the learning. So we thought this was tremendous confirmation that we are on the right track in terms of the kinds of work we've been doing with NovoEd to make sure that you fully integrate a learning process and include all the stakeholders, managers, executives, facilitators, coaches.
Yep. Thank you, Michael. It's great that you're able to collect actual business performance data. That is something that is quite challenging for a lot of organizations to collect. So it is really nice to see that. It makes establishing the ROI much easier. So some final thoughts before we move into the final Q&A here is, here are the 4 powerful digital design principles that I've talked about and proposed today. Hopefully you can take away from this and learn something from them and apply this to your training experiences. We also wanted to provide a reference page that summarized a lot of what we've talked about. On the left here, David talked about some of the trends and how executives are really thinking about customers and sales as something that's top of mind, that they want to increase seller performance and make it more consistent. We have our current situation talking about what's changing and what's staying the same. And then we have our 4 design principles here down below on the right. So just a reference page for you to take a look at in the future. All right, David, let me hand it back over to you.
Sure. One of the questions that comes up is, Michael, you're talking about that last bit, in building in managers into the process and, managers being coaches. We've seen in our own work that that's very important, that managers play such a strong role, but they traditionally haven't, as we've pointed out, that they haven't played that role. So it's one thing to say let's put them in there, but how do you actually get managers to be coaches in the first place?
Great question, because it is one of the biggest struggles. When we do surveys of managers when they're going through training programs on how to coach and ask them about, well, what are your biggest barriers? Number 1 is always time. I don't have time. And so a big part of the value of partnering with NovoEd is we've simplified that process for them. Because when you think about the time it takes to coach, 2/3 of that time is planning, preparing, scheduling, and then doing the coaching. Whereas within the platform, you get a notification, there's an assignment completed, you click on a button, you see the assignment, you have an opportunity to give feedback, and then you click out of it. And what we found is that even if it isn't an extensive coaching activity, if you're saying, good job, Steve, that has power in and of itself, because it shows the salesperson, my manager's paying attention to this. My manager is concerned about this, concerned about my development, concerned about my revenue generation. I'm going to keep going. It's a motivating force for them. The other thing we often, when we're training managers to coach, and they say they don't have time, we often point to the idea that, well, you don't have time to coach, but you do have time to correct the problems they create with customers afterwards. You do have time to recruit and hire a new salesperson when that salesperson doesn't meet their quota requirements. So if you could replace that time with coaching time, would that be valuable? And oftentimes we find that if you get that manager take that first step, saying, fine, I will invest 6 months, a year of my time coaching, they reap the rewards from that and they become lifelong coaches.
So to that point of them at the front saying that they don't have the time, and so they may be thinking they need to prioritize this, is there a method to that? Do you focus on a certain segment of learners, like high performers, middle performers, low performers? Can you prioritize across that?
Yeah, there's to some extent. I mean, there's a lot of controversy on where you should focus your coaching efforts, and we take the perspective that regardless of their level of performance, they need to be coached. But you can choose your opportunities well. You choose when is the coaching activity going to have the biggest impact on the outcome, rather than sit down and do the same coaching activity with each individual. Or you find a commonality. All of us are having, all your salespeople are having trouble asking for the sale. How do I coach the group on asking for the sale? But Steve might have a particular issue with coming up with good discovery questions. So coaching them on how to do good discovery and questioning their customer about their needs can be a more targeted kind of activity.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I get from that too is, in order to be a good coach, that's what's baked in, is the ability to tailor the message to the situation. All right, so we're at the top of the hour, but there's one more question. It's a little open-ended, but maybe Charlie, I'll throw it to you first. Just a general question: what are your thoughts on virtual training? And that's the extent of the question.
Yeah, it's I guess it depends on what you mean by virtual training, and this is part of the challenge, is that where things are evolving. Some people think of virtual training as, well, that's virtual webinar-based training, like we're on a live webinar here or with Zoom. One of the things that we've heard in talking with various learning experts is that the Zoom fatigue is certainly setting in, and if you have sessions that are longer than 90 minutes, or sometimes even longer than 60 minutes, but let's say longer than 90 minutes, you really will suffer, from a big drop in engagement. And if you have virtual live sessions that are bigger than 30 or 35 people, what happens is people start to turn off their cameras, turn off their mics. Only a very small number of people are talking, the 90-10 proportion that Michael referred to. So virtual with live web conferences, it has been a lifesaver for us through this pandemic for sure, but it has its limits, and it doesn't offer you the scale that you would think should be possible with digital platforms. And that's where people are reinventing and reimagining what they can do with digital or virtual training that's not just a simple live synchronous type of training, and not just a simple solo e-learning training as well.
You're so right about the scale issue, because your first guess is, well, it's technology, I can send it anywhere.
Right.
But what everyone forgets in that equation of live to virtual is this inherent connectivity, this inherent engagement that comes with being in person. That's now gone, and you can feel that level of engagement and in person with 100 people in the room because you're there. Now you try to do it in a virtual and it's gone. And so, yeah, you have to figure out how to redo that. And I think you were talking earlier about the skill level there, the facilitator and that sage on the stage versus the guide on the side. And if you think that the sage on the stage doesn't work well live in person, right, it's even worse if you're trying to do that through a virtual presentation. So it requires some rethinking. Right. There's definitely value. Companies, it was a quick fix in the early days of the pandemic, but now I think it's really about rethinking how do we best make use of this and how do we do it. And I think you're spot on with all that, Charlie. Yeah. So we've gone a little over minutes into the questions, which is great. Thank you so much for providing all of this insight. It's really valuable. I know I appreciate it. We appreciate NovoEd for giving us the hour to do this, as well as providing your time, Charlie, and connecting us with you, Michael. This has been excellent, and I'd like to thank everybody that attended and participated in the polls and asked questions. We appreciate that very much. And I'll turn it back. Michael, I'll give you some last thoughts.
Well, great. Well, I really appreciate this opportunity to share what we have done with NovoEd in trying to reinvent sales development. Because one of the biggest challenges, as you mentioned at the beginning, is organizations are desperate to generate revenue and improve the customer experience. And we think that this goes a long way in helping organizations do that. So thank you for the opportunity to share what we're doing.
Great. And thank you too, Charlie.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Hey, Michael.
Hello.
Hey.
I guess we're getting off. Okay.
Yeah. Just so you know, guys, we're not in an ante room, like an after room. It's still just the same platform. So.
Oh, okay. It's still easy. Okay. Thanks. Bye.
All right.